The architect came by and showed me some of the
and you are in the dining room of Thomas Pinckney's house in Charleston.
Ladies and gentlemen, I beg your attention. I pray you give me leave to deliver a message from His Excellency the Governor. You may have noticed the Governor was called away in the midst of dinner. It was a matter of urgent business that could not be delayed. Now, he had thought to have returned in good time, but alas, I have just received a message from him, and he asks me to beg your forgiveness, but he has been detained longer than he anticipated. But he wishes me to assure you that if you will but await him here, he will be with you directly. And I have had a thought. The Governor has told me that you are all interested in hearing about my Indigo project. And indeed, I am vastly flattered that you are interested. And I thought perhaps I would take this opportunity whilst we await his return to satisfy your curiosity on that head, if that meets with your approval. Ah, good. And then I suppose it is best that I start at the beginning, for you might well wonder how it came to be that I began to experiment with indigo here in South Carolina. I was born on the island of Antigua. 'Tis one of the sugar-producing islands in the West Indies. Indeed, my father owned 3 sugar plantations on the island, but he was also an officer in the British regiment that was garrisoned there. Antigua is very small. There are no schools on the island. Those people who can afford to do so sent their children back to England to be educated. And so, when I was 10 years old, I went with my cousin and another young lady to London to attend Mrs. Pearson's boarding school. The school was located in Hackney, a small rural village due north of London. It had fine air and much open land, making it a flourishing center for nursery gardening. And that for me was most fortunate, for I was very early fond of the vegetable world. I liked plants. Not only did I like to garden, I liked to experiment with plants. I thought it an interesting and useful amusement. My father was pleased with it and encouraged it, for you see, my mama did not enjoy good health, and it was my father who saw to my education in the early years before I went off to school. Indeed, it was by his desire that I spent little time at my needlework, which you must know is the fashionable employment for ladies. My father declared that he could never see ladies talking over their needlework without suspecting they was hatching some mischief. Though what mischief we poor ladies could hatch over our sewing, I know not. And of course I did do needlework. But I could not go to my sewing with a quite easy conscience, knowing that my father had an aversion to my employing my time in that kind of work. My experiments with plants were a different matter and quite unexceptional in his view. He encouraged me in all my little projects. He said the turn I had for these amusements might produce something of real and public utility. And indeed, he was in the right of it. For when I come to South Carolina to live, I did produce something of real utility. A blue dye made from the leaves of the indigo plant. Now, I have said that my papa owned sugar plantations on Antigua, but he also owned property here in South Carolina. In 1739, he decided to bring the family hither to live. That is to say, he brought my mama, my little sister Polly, and myself. My 2 younger brothers were still in school in England at the time. We arrived in the late summer of 1739, and we took up residence in one of my father's houses in Charlestown. We had no sooner settled in Then we received word that England had declared war on Spain. Then my papa received his orders. He was to return immediately to Antigua to take up his military duties. And since my mother's bad state of health prevented her from going through any fatigue, it was decided that during my father's absence, I should be in charge of all his property in South Carolina. Now, that included the 2 houses in Charlestown, a 600-acre plantation on Wappoo Creek, a 1,500-acre plantation, Garden Hill, on the Combahee River, and 3,000 acres of rice-growing land along the Waccamaw River. I had not yet reached my 17th birthday. My mama and papa allowed me to choose our place of residence, either in town or in the country. I thought it more prudent, as well as most agreeable, to my mama and myself to be in the country during my father's absence. We settled on the 600-acre plantation on Wappoo Creek across the Ashley River from Charlestown. Now, at that time, well, and still is, rice at that time was the main crop grown here in the low country of South Carolina, and of course it still is. But my papa wanted to diversify on his plantations. He wanted to grow something in addition to rice. When he returned to Antigua, he began to send me seeds, many different kinds of seeds, for me to experiment with to see what would grow best here. That first year, I took great pains to plant indigo, cotton, ginger, alfalfa, and cassava, and bring them to perfection. But I had greater hopes for the indigo than for any of the other things I had tried. So I concentrated most of my efforts on successfully growing the plant and processing it to make the dye. It was not an easy task, and it required much patience, for I had many problems to overcome. My first problem was just getting the seed. The indigo plant, it is not a perennial. That is to say, it does not die off in the fall and come back in the spring. It must be planted anew each year. In the fall of the year, the seed pod that the plant produces, in the fall of the year, it ripens and splits, spilling the seed upon the ground. Now, the seed must be left there to dry. Then it must be gathered and saved to plant in the spring. That first fall, I had a goodly crop of indigo seed upon the ground. The frost got to it before it could dry. I managed to pick through the seed and select some of the best to plant in the spring, but I got only 100 bushes from it. I had to write my father and tell him, we must have the seed from the West Indies in time to plant by the end of March, so the seed will have a chance to drop and dry before our first frost. The next year, I used seed from my own plants and seed that my father sent me from the West Indies. The seed from the West Indies was not good. None of it came up. I used seed from my own plant to plant the next year, and I had a goodly crop of indigo bushes you would not believe. Worms. Worms cut down the plants. Finally, the next year, 5 years after I had first planted the indigo, I had a successful crop. And from then on, we was able to use seed from our own plants and not have to rely on seed being sent from the West Indies. While I was struggling to grow the indigo plants, I was also having some experiments done with making small amounts of the dye. Now, this is a very precise process. It requires careful timing. To help me, my father sent an indigo maker, a man to supervise the making of the dye. His name was Nicholas Cromwell. He was from the island of Montserrat, where much indigo is produced. He was said to be experienced and good at his job. He arrived in the summer of 1741. and he built the vats that he needed to make the dye as soon as he arrived. And he was able to make a very small amount of dye for my second crop. But the indigo bricks that he produced that year and the 2 years following were of such poor quality they were almost worthless. I was most disappointed, and I was not quite satisfied with Cromwell. He was supposed to show me how the whole process worked, and instead, he made a great mystery of the whole matter, blamed the poor quality of the dye upon the climate here. But I discovered, after carefully observing and doing some experiments, that he was mistaken. I also discovered where the blame lay, on Cromwell. He had put so much lime water into the mixture that he quite spoiled the color. Later, he was heard to remark that he was sorry that he had come. He did not want indigo from Carolina to compete with indigo from his native country. Nicholas Cromwell was sent back to Montserrat. He was replaced by his brother Patrick, who was more successful and was able to make 17 pounds of good dye. That was in the summer of 1744, and I had, in May of that year, married my dear Mr. Pinckney. It was he who sent 6 pounds of the dye back to England as a trial to see how it would be received. And indeed, it was well received and said to be as good as the French dye. I was most pleased with the prospect of being able to supply the mother country with a product for which he had so great a demand, and one which he had previously been supplied with by French colonies at a cost of 200,000 to 400,000 pounds a year. 'Tis a vast sum, is it not? And to be paid to a country we was constantly at war with. It made no sense to me when I thought, if the matter were applied to in earnest, that dye could be supplied from here. We saved most of that year's crop for seed, which we gave out to anyone in the colony who would agree to plant it. Indigo can be planted in many different places. It is the perfect second crop for rice plantations. It can be grown on the high ground between the rice fields. And since rice and indigo both require attention at different times of the year, the same field hands can cultivate both crops. It is also a perfect crop for the sea islands, where the saltwater marshes make the cultivation of rice difficult. And it is the perfect cash crop for the backcountry. Indigo soon became a most valuable export from this colony. In 1747, 135,000 pounds of indigo was exported to Great Britain. 25 years later, that amount had risen to well over 1 million. Now, naturally, the production of indigo was halted during our late war with Great Britain, the war for American independence. But now that the war is over, I am pleased to say that indigo is once again a valuable export. However, ladies and gentlemen, I do fear that my interest in indigo declined somewhat after my marriage. It was left to others to make improvements in the growing and processing of the plant. My attention was, shall we say, diverted. It was in February of 1746 that I was pleased to present my dear Mr. Pinckney with a son, Charles Coatsworth, and then a little girl, Harriet, in 48, and another son, Thomas, in 1750. And it was just 3 years later that we all, Mr. Pinckney, myself, and the 3 children, went to England. Little Charles was 7 years old. His father was anxious to enroll him in school in London. We spent the next 5 years living most happily in England. But on our return to Charlestown in 1758, fate dealt our family a dreadful blow. My very, very dear Mr. Pinckney was taken from us. In March of that year, Mr. Pinckney and I had sailed from London to Charlestown with our daughter Harriet, who was then 9 years old. Our sons Charles and Thomas were both enrolled in school in London and did not sail with us. Mr. Pinckney was returning to South Carolina to look after his property with a view to settling his estates, after which we would all return and live in London whilst the boys was in school there. But sadly, a month after our arrival, he was stricken with country fever. 3 weeks later, he died. You may imagine the depth of my grief. He was the best and worthiest of men, the most tender and affectionate of all husbands, and the best of fathers. And to add to my distress, I was separated by a vast ocean from my sons. I could not be with them to console them on the loss of so good a father. I went into a severe decline. Indeed, my friends feared for my very life. But I had to rouse myself, for I was determined. I think my voice magnifier is doing something strange. Hello.
No, there were no pockets in that time, and so there's an additional pocket with the clothes like our history ladies have on here today that seems to have Let me distract you for a moment when Miss Eliza is finished talking to us. Would all of the DAR ladies be in the front for a photograph? With Miss Eliza.
We will see if this is better. I would not use the voice magnifier, but I am an old lady and I do not have the strongest voice. Oh. I was distressed by the death of my husband. But I had to rouse myself, for I was determined to carry out the wishes of my dear husband, who wanted above all things for his sons to be educated in England. The funds needed to maintain the boys at school must needs come from our Carolina estates. They had been neglected for too long a time. I went to work to manage the estates, which required great care and attention, and I had as much business of one kind and another as I could go through. I did manage, though, to take some time to educate my little Harriet. I could not send her away to school, so I taught her myself at home, and great pleasure did I derive from it. I was not to see either of my sons for over 10 years. It was in the spring of 1769 that my oldest son, Charles Coatsworth, completed his studies and returned to Charlestown. 1769, that were a happy year, for not only was I reunited with my oldest son, but I was presented with my first grandchild, little Daniel, born to my dear Harriet, who the year before had married Mr. Daniel Ory, a rice planter from the Santee area. 5 years later, my joy was complete when my youngest son, Thomas, also returned. You can imagine the joy I felt at being reunited with both my sons, now grown into such splendid young men, and to know that all my dear family were together at last. But the joy that we all felt on this occasion was dimmed somewhat by events taking place around us, our continuing disagreements with Great Britain, which finally led to war. Both my sons had been educated in England. Indeed, they had grown up in England. But they were both ardent supporters of the rights of the colonists. My sons felt, just as many planters here in the Low Country felt, that King and Parliament were not treating the colonists with the same respect with which they treated people living in Great Britain, nor granting them the same franchises and liberties. Therefore, when the fighting broke out in the North in the spring of '75, they was both quick to join the army and be commissioned as officers. And as officers in the army, they took part, though not as great a part as they wished, in the defense of Charleston in the summer of '76. And they was both part of the expedition to St. Augustine in '78 and the unsuccessful attack upon Savannah in '79. By that time, Charles had risen in rank to colonel. Indeed, he was commander of the 1st South Carolina Regiment of the Continental Army. Thomas was a major, second in command of the 2nd Battalion of Light Infantry. And of course, they was both here in Charleston to defend the town when the British laid siege to it in the spring of 1780. Charles and Thomas may have been in Charleston, but long before the British began to dig their trenches around the city, the women and children of our family and the families of some of our friends, we had all sought refuge at Hampton, the Ori plantation some 2 and 40 miles from Charleston, a safe distance from the fighting that would take place in the city. We gathered there for safety and to wait for news of what was happening in town, and we tried to keep up our spirits, but it was not easy. For by mid-April, we knew that there was very little hope. Charlestown was completely surrounded. It was only a matter of time before the city must surrender. Just before its fall, General Lincoln ordered Thomas out of town to carry verbal messages to Governor Rutledge. The governor was in Georgetown, trying to put together a counter-force to relieve the city. And indeed, there were Continental troops from Virginia and North Carolina marching south to join him. Thomas was to hasten them on. I suppose they chose Thomas because he knew the countryside well, and he was known to be resourceful and cool in the face of danger. But oh, my poor Thomas, he was obliged to cross 2 rivers and travel through 60 miles of countryside, largely controlled by the British. Thank God he arrived safely. But Charleston was surrendered before the relief force had even crossed the Santee River. However, Thomas was spared the fate of his brother and his comrades in the Continental Army, who were all made prisoners of war at Charleston. We had lost almost the entire Continental Army in the South. It was a grievous loss. The British then set about to bring the rest of the state under their control and round up what was left of our army. After the fall of Charleston, Thomas came to us at Hampton, where members of our family still remained. Thomas's wife was there. She was expecting their first child that summer, and her sister was with her. Charles's wife was there with her 2 little girls. She was also expecting a child that summer. Harriet, myself, Harriet's 2 children, the littlest one just toddling around the house on wobbly legs. And Colonel Ori was there. He had been commander of a cavalry regiment assigned to harry the rear of the British forces besieging Charlestown, and so he had also escaped capture. He had been operating in the Santee area under the command of Governor Rutledge. He came in from camp to spend a few days with us at Hampton. One night, after we had all gone to bed, we had unexpected visitors. Harriet, my granddaughter, a child of no more than 4 or 5, was sleeping on a cot at the foot of my bed when we was both awakened by loud shouts. And suddenly, Mary Mott, the younger sister of my daughter-in-law, rushed into the room crying, "Save me! Mrs. Pinckney, save me! The British are after me!" I quickly jumped up and pushed her down upon the bed, covered her with the bedclothes. "Lie there," I said, "and no man shall dare to trouble you." I walked over to Harriet, her eyes large with fear. I took her trembling hand in mine, and together we waited at the foot of the bed. Suddenly, armed men rushed into the room. I drew myself up to my fullest height, which I grant you is not much, but I can be quite formidable when I choose, and I stared them right in the face. Ladies and gentlemen, they fell over themselves trying to back out of the room. They could not leave fast enough. They was Tories under the command of Major Fraser, who was known to be, shall we say, overzealous in the commission of his duties. They, of course, were looking for Major Pinckney and Colonel Ory. Somehow or other, Major Fraser must have gotten intelligence of their presence at Hampton, and thus the visit. My dear Thomas managed to escape, but Colonel Ory was not so fortunate. He was surrounded by armed men, while outside the house stood more men with lighted torches. Colonel Ory had a most difficult decision to make. He could surrender and become a prisoner of war, in which case the British would most likely take him away, slaughter his animals, and burn his plantation, leaving the women and children with no shelter, no means of transport, and no one to protect them. Or he could ask for British protection, in which case he would be allowed to stay and his plantation would not be burned. But he would have to betray the cause for which he had fought so gallantly. He looked at all of us for a fleeting moment, and I know he could see the concern, the anxiety, even the fear in our faces. He made a most painful choice. He asked for British protection. And although the British took the horses and thoroughly plundered the house, neither the house nor any of the outbuildings was burned. We was all sorry, in one sense, for the step that Colonel Ory had taken. But it was with the greatest gratitude we accepted his support and protection during the remainder of the war. Indeed, if it had not been for the shelter Colonel Ory provided, I would not have had a place to lay my head, either in town or in the country. After his escape from Hampton, Thomas made his way north. His plan was to offer his services to General Washington. Until he could join the army, we all felt must soon be sent to liberate the South. He got as far as Hillsborough in North Carolina, where he learned that the Continental Congress had appointed General Horatio Gates as the new commander of the Southern Department, and that the general, even now, was marching south with an army. Thomas waited his arrival in Hillsborough. He was one of the first men to offer his services to General Gates, and General Gates appointed Thomas as one of his aides. And thus it was that Thomas was at the Battle of Camden. As Thomas explained it to me later, I understand that at some point in the battle, the British line was advancing toward a company of militia. The militia managed to get off 1 or 2 rounds and then panicked as the British kept steadily advancing. They threw down their muskets and fled. The panic was contagious. It passed on to other companies down the line. General Gates, General Caswell, Thomas, and others all tried to rally the fleeing men and get them to reform, but they soon saw that it was not possible. The generals retreated from the field, It was while Thomas was covering their retreat that he was wounded, his left leg shattered by a musket ball. He made his way slowly and painfully to the rear of the lines. He was placed on a wagon with the other wounded and left there. He lay in the greatest pain while the battle raged on. He was found, after the battle was over, unconscious on the wagon, by a British officer, Captain Mackenzie of the 71st Regiment, the Highlanders. He recognized Thomas immediately. They had been schoolmates and friends at Westminster in England. He had Thomas brought into town with the British wounded, and the next day when he visited Thomas, he realized that he would most likely lose his leg, if not his life, unless he was properly attended to. Captain Mackenzie, to whom we shall all be eternally grateful, persuaded Colonel Tarleton to send his regimental surgeon to look after Thomas. The surgeon, against all the odds, managed not only to save Thomas's life, but his leg as well. You may imagine how I longed to go to Camden to nurse my dear son, but that he would not allow. And later, when he was a little better, the British gave his wife permission to fetch him to her family's plantation at Mount Joseph. These were dark days for us in South Carolina, not only for people personally, but for our cause. But as dark as it was, there did appear a small glimmer of hope that summer. Just before he left Charleston to sail back to New York, General Sir Henry Clinton had issued a proclamation stating that anyone who did not actively support the Loyalist cause was an enemy and no longer protected by the army. The militia, who had surrendered in Charlestown and in the various Patriot outposts in the backcountry, had all been promised they could remain neutral. And now they were being told that unless they turned out as Loyalist militia, they were outlaws. Oh, they were angry. They were being forced to make a choice, and many of them chose to support the Patriot cause. They rallied under the leadership of Brigadier General Thomas Sumter, who was the focal point for the resistance. And when he was wounded, the fight was taken up by others, such as General Andrew Pickens and General Francis Marion. General Marion operated in the swamps of the Santee area. He was well known both to Harriet and Colonel Ory. Indeed, the colonel's cousin, Colonel Peter Ory, was General Marion's second in command. Harriet was able to render the general a great service that fall. One night, Harriet was alone at Hampton with only the children. It was late at night and the children were asleep above stairs when she heard a light tapping at the door and a man's voice begging for admittance. It was General Marion, who, having made an unsuccessful attack on the British near Georgetown, was now being pursued by them. He told Harriet that his men had ridden on to where the bridge crosses the creek a few miles off in order to make their way to their stronghold in the Santee Swamp. But the general, worn out and exhausted, had come to beg a supper and a lodging at Hampton. He told Harriet he would follow his men in the morning. She quickly brought him inside and saw to it that supper was fixed for him. While it was cooking, the weary man fell fast asleep in his chair. Then Harriet heard the sound of horses' hooves, the jingle of bits, the rattle of sabers. The British were coming. Quickly, she woke the general, took him to the back door, and pointed down the long garden path to the creek at the bottom of it, and told him to swim across the creek to the island opposite and hide in the rushes until the British had left. She quickly shut the back door, walked across the back passage, opened the door to the front hall, closing it firmly behind her. And then she walked to the front door and opened it. And there before her stood Colonel Bannister Tarleton and several of his dragoons, the last people anyone in South Carolina would want to see at their front door. The colonel demanded that they be allowed to search the house. Harriet graciously invited them inside to search wherever they wished. And very thoughtfully, she went around with them and opened the door to every room and every cupboard in the house. All the while, the man that Colonel Tarleton would have given a fortune to capture was making his way down the garden path across the creek to the safety of the island beyond it. Meanwhile, the British had found the tracks of the general's main party, and Colonel Tarleton's men took off after them, taking a few horses but plundering little else. But Colonel Tarleton did not go with his men. Instead, he invited himself to supper and insisted that Harriet act as his hostess. How my dear Harriet kept her countenance or her wits about her during that summer I know not. When he left, strangely enough, Colonel Tarleton took with him one volume of a set of poems by Milton. Oh, it was a beautiful Baskerville edition, bound in crimson and gold. The companion volume is still at Hampton, as is the chair that General Marion fell asleep in. Harriet vows she will keep them always as a reminder of her night visitors. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, how I have rattled on, and how far I have strayed from my subject of indigo. I do beg your pardon. My tongue, I fear at times it does run on wheels. I have spoken at great length, and I will now have done, unless there are curiosities I have not as yet satisfied. But have you any questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
What markets are you using for your indigo? I understand the British used to give you a bounty and they stopped after the war.
Indeed they have, but as yet they have not found another source. They may in the future, but for now it is still a valuable export. Yes?
Didn't he go to England and then come back and then leave again after the war?
In 1782, was it 82? No, it was 81, I do believe. He left to take his son to England to school, and then he came back. But he was away sometime in England. And sadly, he died in 1785. Yes, ma'am.
Are you well acquainted with General Washington?
I have never had that pleasure. My son Charles knows him quite well. He went north in the lull in the war here in South Carolina in '77. He went north and was part of the general's military family. He is speaks very highly of General Washington. Are there any more questions? Oh, I see James. James, you say the governor is on his way? Oh, indeed, that is good news. Now, ladies and gentlemen, since the governor will be with you shortly, I will take my leave of you. I had promised to spend the hours after dinner with my grandchildren. I do not like to keep them waiting over long. It hath been my pleasure to have spoke with you this day, and I do trust that we shall all meet again. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you good day. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the voice magnifier. I hope it didn't break the mood for you. If you have any questions that you would like to ask me that you didn't feel comfortable asking Eliza, I'll be happy to answer anything.
What sources did you base most of your interpretation?
That she has heard from her grandparents, people who were actually there when these events took place, and that she didn't rely on just one person